Hunger levels around the world are at a new high. A whopping 49 million people in as many as 43 countries are today facing emergency levels of hunger. The number of severely food insecure people has doubled in just 2 years, from 135 million pre-pandemic to 276 million as on date. More than 500,000 people are experiencing famine conditions, which is an increase of over 500% increase since 2016. Now, this seismic hunger crisis has been caused by a deadly combination of factors like conflict, climate change, the COVID pandemic, and not to forget the rising costs worldwide. The war in Ukraine has particularly drastically reduced global supply and triggered price rise increases, threatening to tip tens of millions of people over the edge into food insecurity, followed by malnutrition, mass hunger, and also famine, a crisis that could last for years.
High rates of hunger have a devastating impact on individuals, families, and societies. Children may suffer the lifetime effects of stunting. Millions of women and children will become malnourished. Girls will be pulled from school and forced to work or get married. And families will embark on dangerous journeys across continents just to survive.
So what can be done to avert this catastrophe? How can the world tackle the greatest food insecurity crisis of our time? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tina Jha. It's an absolute pleasure today to welcome on the program experts from different parts of the world. I'm joined today by Mr. Bishoy Parajuli, United Nations World Food Programme representative and also the country director to India. Also joined by Mr. David Laborde, Senior Research Fellow, International Food Policy Research Institute, and Professor Sumantra Ray, Director of Research in Food Security, Health and Society, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, the University of Cambridge. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and welcome to Sansad TV. Mr. Parajuli, allow me to begin the program today with you. You know, when the pandemic struck, it came as the biggest humanitarian crisis for mankind ever since the Second World War. The manner in which the COVID pandemic wreaked havoc for economies worldwide, who would have thought that anything could get worse than this? But today we are in a situation where around 811 million people are going hungry overnight. Give us and our viewers a sense of how did we get to this dire situation?
Thank you for inviting me to share some perspective here. Unfortunately, as you rightly put it earlier, three major factors: increasing level of conflict, wars, the climate change concern, and also the COVID, which hit us last 2.5 years, with implication on rising unemployment, price rise, and added to that is the Ukraine war. These have resulted in a massive rise in food insecurity and hunger. In fact, last October, the Secretary General convened a food systems summit, knowing that there has been such an increase in hunger and to see how that could be tackled. There were a number of innovative and suggestions brought in as a system to work together. But of course, war and conflict causes a devastation. And in fact, the World Food Programme faces every month added, $70–80 million per month due to the war in Ukraine for added cost of fuel and transportation. There is a scarcity in terms of supplies, and as you rightly put it, more countries and more people are facing increased hunger challenges, in the verge of starvation, 49 million people. And of course, this number is going to rise further if this problem is not solved. So important thing which is really needed is we must stop war and conflict. And added to that is we must continue to work in improving food system, build a resilient and adaptive agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and have program and activities which takes care of the vulnerable population.
Absolutely.
Which, like India has.
going forth, how can we do that? How the countries together can actually, turn the tide back is something that I'll come back to you and understand. But coming to you, Mr. Laborde, to understand how grave the situation is, particularly in the countries that were already vulnerable even before the pandemic. The situation was quite bad. And, the executive director of the World Food Programme gave us a sense of how dire, how grim the situation is. He said that, we are in a situation today where we are taking away food from the hungry to give it to those who are starving. Which are the regions, which are the vulnerable countries today that are facing the highest levels of food insecurity?
So the most vulnerable countries today are in particular countries that were in conflict before this crisis. So think about Yemen, think about north of Ethiopia, and so on, where you have population that are already very vulnerable, where local food supply has been totally disrupted. You can also think about refugees in Lebanon or part of Syria, and rely a lot on world market for their food supply, but also activities like WFP is conducting. And so the need of resources to continue this type of activity is pretty important. Then you have a second circle of countries that are today impacted by climate shock. So you have it in various parts of Africa, but also in other locations around the world. And here also, it's normal for this country when they face a drought at home or food at home to try to import more food to rebalance their needs and their supply. And right now, due to the crisis, the global markets are in a pretty bad shape, and that's a problem for them. And then you will have a large number of low and middle income countries for which the poor population spend a lot of money on food, but also on fuel. And currently, right now, they face major economic pressure. And that's where policy action is particularly important. And I would say last but not least, and that's basically everywhere in the world, we have a crisis on the fertilizer markets, meaning that farmers all around the world will struggle to access to their fertilizer, pay for fertilizer, and basically prepare the next harvest. And that, I would say, the medium-term concern we have in the sense that we may have not seen yet the worst of the crisis. And I would say, in particular, for a market like rice, where basically more 3 billion people depend on rice for their daily food consumption. Prices have not increased yet, but what will be going on the fertilizer sectors can really change the situation in the next 6 months.
And, already impacted by climate shocks, also the COVID pandemic, as Mr. Parajuli has already pointed out. But how do you see the recent Ukraine war impacting or exposing the gaps within the world food systems? And particularly because of which now we are seeing there are supply chain gaps also, there are rising food costs and something of a scale that has never been seen before.
So I will say that the good news to some extent is, even if the global food system has some weaknesses, actually it has been incredibly resilient. We have been through shock that we have never seen for the last at least 60 years. A major pandemic crisis, now a war that impacts what are key breadbasket for the world, including one of the largest country on earth. And we see this rising food insecurity, we see this rising famine, but just even 100 years ago, the situation will have been dramatic. Or even in the 70s, if we go back, several countries have a very traumatic experience from them. Here, we have a lot of people at risk, but we can globally respond to that. Yes, the Ukraine crisis is the last drop on the bucket pretty field, and that's a problem. We are losing a significant amount of wheat supply, but also corn supply that have an impact on the livestock sectors around the world. So that's another kind of channel. And as I was saying before, the fertilizer aspect, because Russia and a country like Belarus that also is involved in these geopolitical tensions are key fertilizer exporter, and that's the pressure on world market. But still, we have issues, but hopefully we are in a much better place today to tackle them than we were 30 years ago, thanks to globalization, but also thanks to a lot of policy that countries have implemented, support to the farmers, and technological innovation.
Okay, so that's one positive outlook that you've pointed out, that our systems have been resilient, the fact that we need to make it much more stronger to absorb shocks of this kind so that those who are already at the receiving end, those who are very vulnerable, should not be, made to suffer a lot. Professor Ray, coming to you to understand, of course, we've been through a situation 2.5 years, we've been reeling under the pandemic. One of the senior economists at the IMF, I remember, said last year that the pandemic has already set the world back by a decade, pushing the prevalence of undernourishment to 9.9%. And of course, through a combination of lost income, food price rises, rising inequality in countries in Asia and Africa particularly. How do you see the current geopolitical tensions, the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts elsewhere also worsening the situation?
So thank you for inviting me to speak. And just to clarify that I'm speaking on behalf of the NEDPRO Global Centre for Nutrition and Health, which is an independent think tank in Cambridge, as well as the Tigris program in Cambridge, which is an agricultural and nutrition research program involving both the UK and India. So in fact, over the past 5 years or so, we've had the opportunity to in fact foresee perhaps some of the stress points which are now emerging as potential points of fracture. And just to explain what I mean by that, I think we probably need to take a step back and think how all the different pieces of the chain are connected, because we need to go upstream and think about actually food production, what that does in terms of the food supply chain, the food environment, and then food choices, which are dependent on purchasing power. And then ultimately that impacts nutrition and health. And in fact, what we are seeing is really a double burden of both under and overnutrition, as well as the undersupply of essential micronutrients in the diet. So whilst there is hunger, there is also hidden hunger, because there may be adequate food for individuals and communities, but hidden hunger has been a problem for a very long time, where people are receiving adequate food, but not the right quality of food to support human health. This has become very evident in the pandemic, where the resilience of different communities from a health perspective has also been dependent on their nutritional resilience. And this, of course, means that when we think about food security, we need to think about not just the numbers who are experiencing absolute hunger, but also the numbers who are experiencing nutrition insecurity on top of that. And that means that we need to think about all of the different factors that influence the food system, whether they're economic, political, or indeed scientific and technological. And the food system doesn't sit in isolation, so there's an overlap between the food system, the health system, and education systems. And really, when we think about a geopolitical response, we need to break it down to the response that's required in each of those spheres, or really each of those parts of the chain that I described. And then we would get an idea of the true picture and pattern of burden that we're facing, but also that enables us to formulate a more targeted response to each of those components.
Absolutely. And you very rightly said, all of these components are so, interconnected with each other, Mr. Parajuli, that the fact now is that the countries need to step up their efforts and sort of try to pull back those who've already fallen to the brink because of the pandemic 2 years. And we have to turn the crisis before it gets too late, particularly in this very year. 2022 marks halfway journey through the 2030 UN SDGs. Now, at this time, it's very crucial for countries to accelerate their efforts because the pandemic has sort of set us back. But what we are witnessing, on the contrary, is more and more countries resorting to protectionist policies. How is that compounding the already catastrophic scenario that we are witnessing?
Are you asking me to respond?
Yes, Mr. Parajuli.
Okay, thank you very much. As a matter of principle, WFP always advocates for open market policy because it helps free access of food, free flow of food, and for people to buy and sell. So then the speculative market is not there. But contrary, of course, the countries do what fits well for them, or what they think is good for them, and that can have a sort of ripple effect in terms of prices, sudden price changes, as well as hoarding, and also the vulnerable countries suffering. I mean, that applies in all situations, food, or we saw in the time of vaccine, the restriction in vaccine supplies, and that suffering. So I think the important thing to do is, especially for the humanitarian purpose, there should be absolutely no restrictions, and a total open door availability and support globally from all countries, and then as well as I mean, it's broadly. It's not that there is not enough food in the world. There is enough food in the world. The issue is supply chain disruption and accessibility for the vulnerable population.
Yes.
Important thing for the countries is to bring that component of addressing the vulnerable population.
Absolutely. Mr. Laborde, coming to you to understand, because there is no shortage of food. This has been reiterated by the United Nations, by several global bodies, by the World Food Programme as well. There is just the fear of prospects of food shortages in the future, which is now forcing countries to, take steps like protectionist policies, what we've discussed. But the fact of accessibility and disruptions to global supply chain are the two short-term challenges that the world needs to address to actually, get this crisis under control. At the World Economic Forum, where we saw leaders, or global leaders congregate, was any such action plan discussed? Have the countries discussed how to get over this crisis in the short-term plan?
Yes, I think that there are a lot of discussion. Now, what we really need is action. The good news is that both international financial institutions, some countries, in particular led by the G7 initiative, but I think also that will be supported by the G20, are trying to put in place some coordinated answers. The key challenge is, in order to face this crisis, it will cost money. Money for continuing humanitarian operations that are just much more expensive to conduct due to high price of food and high price of oil, but also, as it has been said by my colleagues, to protect vulnerable people, and not just about basic needs in terms of caloric and basic staple food, but also make sure that nutrition is not sacrificed in order that the kids that are growing right now doesn't pay the price of this crisis all their life. And the question is where you get this money, how you mobilize it, because at the same time you cannot just ask countries, in particular poor countries, to get more indebted in order to pay for their safety net. And we are going to see, I think, in the next few days and few weeks, if countries are ready really to put the resources in front of their statement. Right now, one of the big initiatives is the Global Alliance for Food Security that is shaping and trying to coordinate various responses, but that really reveals the challenge.
Absolutely.
And we need to mobilize financial resources.
How effective is this alliance going to be? Something that we'll have to all wait and watch. But Professor Ray, we've spoken about how conflict has impacted or sort of compounded the global food crisis that we're witnessing. While conflict remains the major driver, we cannot overlook climate change. Climate shocks in the last few years have aggravated this problem. So if we try and understand how is climate change actually driving changes to our global food systems and in a way leading to this massive increase in global food insecurity and nutrition?
Absolutely. And I think that the program I described earlier, known as Tigris, is an acronym for Transforming India's Green Revolution for the second time for empowerment and sustainable food supplies. And one of the things that that program was looking to do was actually use action research to inform policy, particularly around some of the changes necessary to cropping patterns, for instance. When the first Green Revolution took place, it was absolutely appropriate at that point in time, but it introduced certain cash crops into the system, which have since actually been mirrored in many economies of the world. And that has actually changed what is in the food supply chain. It's actually also changed the nutritional profile of the population and also the risks relating to malnutrition. Now, coming back to climate change, we are now seeing an increasing situation where the soil and land is unable to sustain the same sorts of cash crops. And for instance, next year is a ray of hope because it's the United Nations Year of the Millet. So moving to different types of crops and actually beginning to think medium term to long term and not just about the response to this crisis means that we can begin to think about how to utilize our land in a more eco-friendly and economically friendly way, and one that will put less stress on the agroecological system, but will also actually bring more benefit to food supply and human health. And that, of course, requires changes at multiple levels, at the level of economics, at the level of the political drivers that underpin trade, but also at the level of consumers and what consumers expect, as well as their purchasing power and so on. So really, this is an opportunity in some ways to think beyond the current crisis and actually bring about this type of systems change that is nutrition sensitive agriculture that's also climate friendly and future proof. And it is possible to use some of the findings from research to actually begin to pilot and then draw out these solutions. And so whilst the need of the hour is very evident, there is also a future need which we need to start responding to at this very moment.
Absolutely. And there is this risk always that short-term plans or short-term gains can impact the long-term action plans that you've spoken about. Mr. Parajuli, let me bring you in once again and to understand, because India has particularly been impacted severely by climate change. We've been seeing extreme weather events in our country over the last few years. And it's important for us, if we also look at the Global Food Policy Report, it has warned that climate change may push many Indians towards hunger by 2030 because there'll be a decline in agricultural production and, of course, disruption in the food supply chain, which we have already begun to see. So the challenge here is to increase food production, which is also sustainable at the same time. So how is India ensuring sustainable practices, which provides enough food for its population and also for the world, and helps us meet our climate challenges, climate goals?
In the last 50, 60 years, the transformation India has brought in terms of production has been enormous. From our 55 million tons, it produces 300 million tons now. But there has not been much attention to sustainable system, minimizing and also protecting use of water and climate and etc. And also there has not been much attention that the shift in climate which has happened so far. So I think the next decades will be precisely to address those concerns while increasing productivity, while increasing production. There is a need to also safeguard and minimize water use and move towards climate adaptation and diversify livelihood. There are increasing efforts already in terms of policies and action, different crops based on different climatic zones. But those are the efforts need to be intensified. And as India did it during the whole time of the Green Revolution, it depended on sheep to come and feed, but now India is feeding the rest of the world in that sense. Already exported about 15, 20 million tons of wheat and etc. And it has its massive program like this Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana during the whole last 2.5 years has been giving every family, every individual 5 kilo of rice or wheat. I mean, that has been a massive support and lifeline to the people. So that momentum in terms of increasing supply, safeguarding people's need, but at the same time adapting to the climate is critical for India to succeed in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Absolutely. And this is where not just India, other developing nations as well as, of course, in coordination with the developed world, they have to all come together and play a key role. Mr. Laborde, coming to you for one final comment, because solving the global food crisis is everyone's business, considering the fact that food production has to increase more than 60% by 2050 to feed the entire world. So what is the long-term solution? We are already reeling under a great crisis at the moment, but there are often, risks that short-term efforts will combat food shortages and they will come at the expense of meeting climate and sustainable targets. So globally, what is the kind of planned action that needs to be adopted so that both can be taken care of, food production as well as climate targets?
So on one hand, making a stop of all these protectionist policies are pretty important, because the world can manage the risk and the shock that climate change will bring only if we work together and if we basically do risk management together. Otherwise, one country will fall after the other. Just this year, for example, Morocco is going to lose 50% of their grain production just due to a drought, and they have to rely on regional and world market to do that. And we all want to curb the climate change crisis and to reduce emission, but we are already on a trajectory where things have happened and will continue to happen, so we need to act collectively. And then there is this question of working on policy reforms, because sometimes some country doesn't want to do it alone. So for example, there's a lot of work to do on fertilizer policy, fertilizer subsidies, for instance, and we want the big players to act together to promote a more sustainable farm production. And I would say last but not least is knowledge, innovation, technology, and to make sure that small farmers also can adopt this new technology. If we want to produce more with less natural resources, we need to increase productivity.
Certainly. And innovative technologies, regenerative techniques are something which will improve agricultural productivity, and that is something that needs to be done in coordination. So that having been said, I'll have to wrap up the discussion today. Thank you, gentlemen, once again for joining us on the program, sharing your thoughts and giving us your insights on this very, very important subject for us and our viewers. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the program today. So that's it from us on this edition of the Global Debate. Thank you to all my viewers as well for your time. See you again same time next week with another topic and another set of panelists as well. So until then, take care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.